Welcome to Fusion Ha. Before we begin tonight's journey, take a moment to gently settle in. If you enjoy peaceful stories that help you unwind, consider subscribing to Fusion Ha. New calming tales await you here, crafted to help you drift into the softest, deepest sleep. No pressure, no noise. Just gentle guidance into rest. Now, let's close the day together. The world outside may still be moving, but here, everything is slowing down wherever you are, whether curled up in bed or resting under a warm blanket. This is your time. A time to let go, to breathe slower, and to gently prepare your mind for rest. Start by noticing your breath, not forcing it. Just noticing it. Inhale softly through your nose and exhale slowly through your mouth. Again, slowly. Inhale and exhale. There's nothing you need to do right now. No task to complete. No problem to solve. The only thing you're here to do is rest. Let your body melt just a little more into wherever you're lying. Feel the pillow gently cradling your head. Notice how the bed beneath you rises to meet your body, softly supporting each curve and angle with no demand. Just peace outside. Your window, imagine rain, not a storm, just a calm, rhythmic rain. The kind that falls in the early hours of the night, tapping gently against rooftops and windows. A sound so familiar, so soft, that it almost sounds like a lullaby. Tick, tick, tick. The sound of rain is joined by another sound, one far away, but steady. It's the quiet ticking of old clocks, somewhere in the distance, perhaps on a cobblestone street tucked away behind old iron lanterns and ivy-covered walls. There's a small workshop. Inside that workshop, hundreds of clocks tick together. Soft, layered ticking, no two clocks in perfect sync, yet all moving forward. Each tick is a gentle nudge away from your thoughts and toward rest. As you breathe, imagine that you are walking through a quiet town at night. The rain falls softly against your coat. The air smells faintly of wood, oil, and cool night air. The streets are empty, lit only by the flicker of gas lamps that line the road. Your footsteps are light. Your pace is slow. There's no need to hurry. Somewhere down the lane, you see a golden light glowing from a single window. Warm, inviting, familiar. You feel drawn to it. The sign hanging above the door is carved in delicate cursive. It reads, Everhart's Clockworks. Since 1824, you reach for the handle. It's old and brass and cool to the touch. As you gently open the door, a soft bell rings, a clear, gentle chime that echoes through the space like the start of a dream. Inside, you feel the warmth of the room instantly. Oil lamps glow on wooden shelves. The walls are lined with clocks, grandfather. Clocks, cuckoo clocks, pocket watches, mantle clocks, all ticking in harmony, yet each with its own unique rhythm. There's something magical here. Something timeless. In the corner, a small fire crackles in an iron stove, casting slow-moving shadows across the wood-paneled walls. You take a seat on a well-worn leather chair near the fire. There's no rush to go anywhere else. Here, in this little clockmaker's workshop, time has a different meaning. It stretches out like a lullaby, moving gently, without pressure. The ticking becomes like a heartbeat. Rain on the windows becomes your blanket. The warm light becomes your peace. And now, as you begin to close your eyes, let's step deeper into this night, a night where time slows, where stories unfold in the quiet between ticks, where the old clockmaker still works by lamplight, and where you are free to drift into dreams. The Clockmaker's Workshop at Midnight, Part 1. The Keeper of Forgotten Time. The clocks whispered. That was the first thing you noticed, how the sound wasn't loud, but it was everywhere. hundreds of tiny gears and pendulums swaying in their own quiet rhythm. Some ticked slowly, others ticked fast, and a few ticked in gentle delay as if they had stories of their own to tell, and in the middle of it all sat the old man. He wore a thick wool vest, slightly wrinkled with rolled up sleeves that revealed arms dusted with brass filings. A magnifying glass hung from his neck on a worn leather cord. His eyes, behind round spectacles, followed the sweep of a second hand as if it were a falling star. His name was Mr. Eldrick Everhart, and he was the last clockmaker on Wren Street. Eldrick didn't speak to many people these days. His workshop was not one people stumbled into by accident. In fact, most people forgot it existed at all, tucked away behind a crooked alley and 2 ivy-covered posts. But those who found it, they always remembered on this particular night, the one year visiting Eldrick was working on something different. He sat at his wooden workbench, surrounded by tiny cogs no bigger than seeds, thin screwdrivers, and velvet cloth stained with oil. But in front of him wasn't just any clock. It was one he hadn't touched in nearly 30 years. Its case was dark cherry wood, carved with moon phases and stars. The glass face had a soft golden tint, and the hands, they were delicate, shaped like swan feathers. One was missing, our hand, and Eldrick held it now between a pair of long tweezers, studying its shape like it held a memory. Outside, the rain whispered against the window. A clock above the door let out a single chime. Midnight, the fire in the stove hissed softly. As the wood inside settled, Eldrick looked up from his bench, as if sensing something. Perhaps it was you. Or perhaps it was the night itself, but he smiled, not the kind of smile you give in passing. This one was warm, almost knowing, like he recognized the quiet soul of someone who needed rest. He stood slowly, stretching his back, and walked over to the shelves behind him. Each clock was labeled not by brand or by size, but by story. There was the train conductor's pocket watch, rusted on the edge, but still ticking. There was the music teacher's metronome, perfectly in time. And there was the boy who couldn't sleep, a tiny clock that ticked a bit fast, but always found its way back to rhythm by morning. Eldrick ran his fingers gently along the edge of each case. These clocks, he once said to someone long ago, don't just count seconds. They keep moments. They hold them like letters sealed in envelopes. Some ticking for love, some for grief, but all of them trying to be remembered. He walked back to the bench and picked up the old feathered hour hand. With slow precision, he lowered it into place. Click. It settled as if it had never left. The clock let out a soft whir, and for a moment, every other ticking sound in the workshop seemed to pause. As if listening, Eldrick leaned back in his chair. Then, he did something he hadn't done in years. He opened the bottom drawer of his desk and pulled out a small leather-bound book. It was his journal of forgotten time. Inside were stories, not of clocks, but of people. People who had walked into this workshop sometimes decades ago and left something behind. A watch, a tale, a wish. He flipped through the pages. October 3rd, 1981. The young woman with silver shoes who wept when her father's clock chimed again. May 22nd, 1993, the sailor who wanted a clock that could hold his memories of the sea. January 17th, 2004, the boy who claimed time stopped when his dog passed away and asked if I could fix it. Each entry was written in Aldrich's neat, looping script, but the ink had faded, just slightly, as if the pages were whispering, too softly reminding him of all the people who had once passed through his world of ticking time. He paused on a blank page, then picked up his fountain pen. Tonight, he began, I was visited by silence, but it felt like company. And with that, he looked toward the window once more. The rain was steady now, dancing down the glass in narrow trails. Street lamps glowed like amber candles, and the world outside looked like it had been painted with stillness. Aldrich closed the journal. He placed it on the shelf beside a small porcelain owl, a gift from a customer long ago, and turned back to his bench. And this is where you remain for now, here in this warm, ticking sanctuary, with rain falling outside and firelight curling across the wood, with time moving gently, not to measure the rush of life, but to soothe it, to give it pause, to give you peace. As you rest here with him, perhaps curled in that old leather chair by the fire, let your thoughts soften, let them float like dust in lamplight, unimportant, weightless, free, because this night is not about remembering schedules or solving anything at all. It is only about feeling safe, still, and deeply, wonderfully sleepy. Part 2. The clock beneath the floorboard fire crackled softly behind you, not in a loud, distracting way, but in the kind of rhythm that felt as old as the wood in the walls. Each flicker of orange and gold cast slow-moving shadows across the room, dancing quietly on the shelves where the clock stood, patient, unwavering. Like sentinels of time, Aldrich sat still at his workbench, the way a writer might sit before a blank page, listening, not for noise but for feeling, for the quiet things that speak only when the world around them slows down. Then, something shifted. It was subtle, barely there, a slight creak in the old wooden floorboards, just behind his chair, not caused by movement, not from the wind, but from beneath. Aldrich looked down, his brow furrowed not in fear, but in curiosity. He reached down slowly and brushed aside an old braided rug that had sat there for decades. There it was, a small wooden square, different from the others, faintly outlined, hidden in plain sight, a floorboard door. He hadn't seen it in years, with a small iron key kept on a string tied to the leg of his workbench. He opened the latch. The door lifted with a gentle creak, revealing a shallow space below the floor, lined in cedar. Inside lay a clock, but not just any clock. It was unlike the others. This one didn't tick. It didn't chime. It didn't even move. It simply glowed, a soft, pale glow like moonlight on snow. Its frame was made of a silvery wood he couldn't name. Not quite ash, not quite birch, something older, more forgotten. The face was blank, no hands, no numbers, just a smooth circle of pearl-like glass, and yet it pulls gently, not with light, but with memory. Aldrich stared at it, feeling the weight of it pull something out of him. A name. A moment. A winter night. A woman with stars sewn into her scarf. A promise. Made long ago. He picked it up carefully, as if waking. Something from sleep. You watched him carry it to the table. He laid it on a square of velvet and lit the smallest oil lamp in the corner. The flame was quiet, no bigger than a coin, casting a silvery hue across the surface of the strange clock. He opened his journal, not the journal of forgotten time. This was a smaller one. Black leather, no name. Inside were only 3 pages, and only one was written, the memory clock, given to me on a snow-covered night by a woman who said, "Some clocks do not keep time. They keep love. I have never wound it. I have never needed to dot. It only glows when someone remembers something they've tried to forget." Aldrich paused. Then he looked up. His eyes didn't search the room, but rather the space beyond it, almost like he could sense you watching, and maybe he could. He closed the small black book and placed it beside the memory clock. Then he spoke, softly. "For the first time tonight, some clocks," he said, "are not made to move forward. They are made to hold what we can't carry." What? We try to hide in busy days and loud thoughts. He turned the clock slightly so that the light from the lamp shimmered across its glass face. "You may not hear ticking," he said, "but that doesn't mean it isn't working." You sat quietly still in that warm chair near the fire watching this gentle man speak with the kind of calm you didn't know you needed. A calm that didn't ask questions, that didn't demand anything in return. Just presence. Aldrich looked back at the memory clock and smiled faintly. "I wonder," he whispered, "what it's glowing for tonight." And though you weren't sure how, you felt something stir. Something within you, a face, a sound, a place you hadn't visited in. Your thoughts for a long time, not painful, not loud, just soft, a memory, one that had been resting quietly in the corners of your mind, waiting for a night like this. A safe night, a still one. The glow of the memory clock shimmered gently, and the rest of the workshop felt quieter than ever before. Even the rain outside seemed to hush, falling now like a lullaby on the rooftops above, and in this moment, you let yourself feel safe enough to remember, safe enough to rest, safe enough to let go. Aldrich leaned back in his chair once again. The light around him, soft and flickering. He wasn't watching the clock anymore. He was simply there, present, steady, a keeper of forgotten time. And as the night stretched deeper into its quiet hours, something beautiful settled into the air. A silence that didn't feel emptied out. It felt full of stories, of people, of memories, stored in tiny ticking machines and glowing faces with no hands. And in this soft world, where nothing rushed, where time unfolded like petals instead of slipping through fingers, you began to drift, not away from the story, but deeper into it, into a night that was made just for you, where clocks don't chase time. They cradle it, and you are finally, wonderfully, at peace. Part 3. The visitor who came at 3:17 a.m. the night had grown deeper. The rain outside had softened into a gentle drizzle. no longer tapping on the glass, but simply resting against it, like the sky itself had fallen into a soft, slow sleep inside. The workshop, the glow from the oil lamps had dimmed ever so slightly, not out of neglect, but as if the room itself understood it was time to quiet down. Even further, Aldrich sat still. The memory clock lay on the velvet cloth, its glow a little warmer now, like the embers of a fire nearing the end of its story. He glanced once at the long brass clock hanging by the front door. Its pendulum swayed slowly, the second hand crawling. Like it, too, was dozing off. And then, at exactly 3:17 a.m., it made a sound, not a chime, not a bell, but a soft, almost imperceptible click. Aldrich's head lifted slightly. His eyes flicked toward the door. He stood, stretched his back gently, his joints moving with the kind of careful respect a man learns after many winters, and walked to the front of the shop. He unlocked the door and opened it. Standing there on the quiet, cobbled path outside was a young woman. She wore a coat the color of wet sand, her shoulders dusted with mist. In her arms was a wooden box, no bigger than a bread loaf, wrapped in an old linen cloth. Her eyes looked tired, but not from lack of sleep, from remembering too much. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. Aldrich simply nodded and stepped aside. The woman entered the shop, and the door closed softly behind her. The room didn't feel startled by her presence. It welcomed her, the way an old quilt welcomes a chilled traveler. She walked to the workbench and set the box down gently. Her fingers lingered on the top for just a second before pulling away. Aldrich waited patiently, and then, in a voice that sounded like it had crossed a long road just to speak, she said, "I believe it stopped." The moment he did, Aldrich didn't ask who. He didn't need to. Instead, he opened the box. Inside was a clock, a small one, shaped like a seashell. The frame was carved from pale wood, smoothed from years of handling. The hands had stopped between 3 and 4, frozen in time. He looked at her, and she nodded once. "It was my grandfather's," she said. "He gave it to me when I was 7. Said it would always know when I needed to feel close to him." Her voice was steady, but her hands, they trembled, just slightly. Aldrich examined the clock, turning it slowly in his palms. It was warm. Not mechanically warm in the way something is when it holds 1,000 little memories. He set it on the workbench beside the memory clock. The two clocks didn't touch, but the air between them seemed to shift, just faintly, as if they were recognizing each other not by name, but by purpose. Aldrich looked up. "May I ask," he said softly, "what time it stopped?" She looked at the frozen hands. 3:17. She whispered. "That's when the hospital called." Aldrich nodded, his eyes kind. "And now you'd like it to tick again?" She hesitated, then slowly shook her head. "No," she said. "I don't want to fix it. I wanted someone to see it. Someone who understands clocks that don't move." Aldrich understood some. Clocks weren't meant to be repaired. Some were meant to remember. He gently closed the box again. He didn't offer advice, didn't offer comfort in the form of words. Just a moment of silence. Shared. The woman stepped back, and looked around. The workshop. She smiled, just a little. It smells like his workshop, she said. Wood, oil, dust, time. Eldrick chuckled softly. That's a good recipe, he said. She looked at the shelves, the dozens of ticking pieces, each telling their own quiet story, and finally turned to leave. But just before the door closed, she paused. Thank you, she said. Eldrick nodded. Once, and then she was gone. The rain picked up again, just slightly, like the sky had listened to the story and felt the need to say something too. Back at the bench, Eldrick placed the small wooden box gently on a high shelf. Next to a clock shaped like a cat and another made from piano keys. He didn't label it. Some things didn't need labels. He returned to his chair by the fire. The memory clock still glowed. Not bright, not loud, just a steady pulse, like a soft breath in a quiet room. And you felt it too, not just the ticking, but the truth of it, that sometimes we don't need to fix everything. We just need to hold it, to witness it, to let the memory live somewhere, safe, and in this workshop, cradled in warmth, in wood. In whispers you found that place. You didn't even realize your eyes were getting heavy. But they were. And Eldrick, in the dim golden light, quietly turned the page of his journal and began to write once more. 3:17 a.m. A visitor brought a clock that no longer ticked. It was not broken. It was complete. The words faded into the air like wood smoke, and the room settled again into deep, perfect calm. Somewhere, another clock chimed once. A single note, enough to remind you. Time is still here, but tonight it belongs to peace. Part 4. The hourglass inside the wall. Rain had almost stopped now. Only the occasional drop struck the window, like a sleepy knock from the night sky. The world outside was resting, and inside the little clockmaker's workshop, time had become so gentle, so quiet. It felt as though the hours were cradling the very air. Eldrick had not yet moved from his chair. The small wooden box from the visitor now rested peacefully on the high shelf, its presence changing the room in the smallest of ways, like the faintest breeze opening the edge of a curtain. The memory clock beside him continued its slow, soft glow, and somewhere beyond the ticking, beyond the warm lamps and sleepy firelight, was something else, a hum, not loud, not disruptive, more like a presence, a quiet energy that came only in the deepest hours of the night, when the world had exhaled completely and forgotten to breathe in again. Eldrick noticed it. He had felt it before. He stood slowly, running his fingers over the spine of his leather journal as he passed. His feet made no sound on the old wooden floor, like the boards themselves were listening. He crossed the room toward the back corner, a space where few ever went. A small grandfather clock stood there, taller than Eldrick himself, its surface carved with delicate vines and stars. He placed one hand gently on the side. Then he pressed, not hard, just enough to release a soft internal latch. The clock swung open, not just the door, but the whole case, revealing a narrow stone wall behind it. You might not have noticed it before. It looked like part of the structure, but up close, you could see it was different, older, uneven, as if it didn't belong in this building at all. but had been brought here from somewhere else, some forgotten temple, some faraway cottage swallowed. By time, Eldrick reached up and removed a wooden panel. Behind it sat an hourglass, but this was no ordinary hourglass dot. A T stood about the size of a lantern, encased in a brass frame shaped like the number 8. The glass itself was perfectly clear, without a single blemish, and the sand inside, if it was sand at all, shimmered with the color of pearl and lavender and silver. It didn't fall in grains, but in threads, silken threads of time. Eldrick stared at it for a long while, and then, very gently, he turned it over. The hourglass responded immediately. A soft hum filled the wall. Not mechanical, not magic, just time awakening. As the threads of glowing sand began to fall, the room shifted. Not visibly, not with motion, but in presence. The clocks around the shop began ticking just slightly slower. The fire in the stove curved a little more deeply into its embers. Even the light seemed to soften, as though passing through fabric. You felt it too, something changing, not in a way that startled, but in a way that invited you to listen more closely. To breathe more deeply. To let go. Eldrick returned to the center of the workshop. The memory clock now pulsed in rhythm with the falling threads of sand, each glow corresponding with a drop. It felt as if the entire room had fallen into sync, not with time as we know it, but with a version that had forgotten about hours and minutes altogether. He sat again, picked up his pen, and opened the black journal, not the one with forgotten stories, but the other. The one with only 3 pages. He turned to the second, still blank, and then, as if he were merely transcribing something whispered into his ear by the hourglass itself, he began to write. When I was a boy, my grandfather taught me to listen to clocks before I ever learned to repair them. Each one speaks, he told me, but not in words. This hourglass belonged to him. He called it the time between moments, not past, not future, just the space between, the place where we breathe before we remember or forget. Eldrick paused, his eyes soft, his hand resting gently on the paper. The air around him had grown warmer, as if the stories in the room were beginning to stir, stretching out of their gears and glass and into the space that held your attention. He leaned back and spoke aloud, though not to anyone in particular. Most people think time moves forward, he said, but there are nights like this, when time simply holds us, and we're allowed to pause. He looked toward the far wall, one filled with clocks in every size, shape, and origin. But his gaze was focused on a small one near the bottom corner. A T was shaped like a ship's wheel. Its face was cracked, but the hand still turned. That clock, he said softly, belonged to a woman who spent her life waiting for letters that never came. Her son was a sailor. She'd wind the clock every week. Said it kept her from drifting too far from hope. He stood and walked to it. The wheel turned gently under his fingers, she once told me. Some people keep clocks so they don't forget what they're waiting for. He let the wheel settle back into place and returned to his chair. The memory clock glowed a little stronger now, and the hourglass continued to fall slowly, steadily, not counting down, but holding space for stories, for peace, for moments like this. And in that warm, lamplit room, you felt a deep stillness grow inside your chest, like something exhaled in your soul, a kind of soft clarity that comes not with understanding, but with release. You didn't need to know what every clock meant. You didn't need to chase time tonight. You were allowed to simply exist here, now, held gently in the time between moments. Aldrich turned the page again, the final page of the black journal, and though no ink had touched it yet, he smiled just slightly. Not tonight, he whispered. This page will wait, and he closed the book. The hourglass continued to hum, its sand falling like moonlight into a dream. Outside, the sky had begun to lighten, not with sun, but with the kind of pale glow that comes just before morning. You hadn't even noticed how long you'd been here, and yet it didn't matter. You were resting, held, safe, and the clocks around you, they weren't rushing you. They were keeping time for you until you were ready to begin again. And as your eyes grew heavier, as your breathing slowed, as the final threads of thought melted quietly from your mind, the room held you in perfect silence, perfect stillness, a pause that asked for nothing except rest. Part 5. The letter inside the grandfather clock. The hourglass continued to fall. Its delicate strands of silvery sand glowed softly as they passed from one chamber to the other, echoing faintly into the room like the distant rustle of pages being turned in an old book. The workshop felt timeless now, not just quiet, but suspended as if it were floating between one breath and the next, between the final hour of night and the first breath of morning. And Aldrich Everhart was still awake. He sat by the fire, not working now, but listening to what, you might ask. Not to the clocks. They ticked on, of course, some with their usual certainty, others drifting slightly behind or ahead. But Aldrich wasn't listening to them tonight. He was listening to memory, not his own, and not entirely yours, but to memory itself, as if it were a visitor that came only in the softest hours. Before dawn, with a quiet sigh, he stood. His steps were gentle on the floorboards, as if trying not to disturb the stories sleeping in each clock. He made his way across the room to one of the oldest pieces in the shop, a towering grandfather clock, carved with vines and leaves along its frame, the kind of clock you'd find in a mansion or a library untouched for decades. Its pendulum was slow, very slow, almost still. He opened the tall glass door and reached behind the panel at its back, and from there he retrieved a letter wrapped in twine, yellowed from age, its paper soft with time, yet perfectly intact. The name on the front was faint, almost gone, but Aldrich traced it with his finger as if it were still fresh ink. He returned to his bench and sat down. You watched from the warmth of your chair by the fire, eyes half closed, body heavy, mind floating in the soft rhythm of the ticking. Aldrich untied the twine and unfolded the letter. He didn't read it aloud, but he remembered every word because the letter had been written by himself years ago, maybe decades, to someone who never received it, not because it was lost, but because it was never sent. He had written it during a stormy autumn evening, when the clocks had all fallen silent at once. A power outage, perhaps. or something stranger. He never found out. All he knew was, that night, he had felt alone in a way he couldn't explain. Not lonely, just adrift. So he had written a letter. To someone he imagined might one day walk into his shop. A stranger. A soul who didn't need to buy a clock or ask for the time, but someone who needed to be reminded that the world could slow down. That time could be kind, and the letter began like this. To the one who found their way here, I don't know your name. I don't know your story, but if you're holding this letter, then you're someone who needed to feel what time rarely gives us. Stillness. Aldrich read the words in silence, lips barely moving, and though his expression did not change. His eyes shimmered just a little brighter in the firelight. He placed the letter on the table, beside the memory clock. Its glow gently intensified. As if acknowledging the weight of what had been placed before it, he leaned back in his chair and looked toward you, and for the first time, it felt like the story was not being told about him, but to you. As if every moment in this room was building toward something meant to be given, a gift, a message. Not loud, not urgent, but soft. Essential, you know, Aldrich said quietly. Most people think of clocks as reminders of how little time we have. How fast it passes. He paused, reaching for a small silver piece on the shelf, a compass. Not a clock, but I've always seen them differently. I think clocks are gentle guides. They don't rush us. They're steady, present, reminding us that every moment, no matter how small, is still ours to hold. He let the compass rest in his palm a moment longer before setting it beside the letter. Then, without saying anything else, he stood and crossed the room again, this time to the far back corner, past the workbench, past the hourglass, which was still softly humming in its rhythm. Here there was a narrow wooden door. Most would mistake it for a broom closet, but Aldrich opened it with care, and inside was a room of silence. No clocks ticked here. No pendulums swayed. No light flickered. It was still, not dark, not cold, just still. The shelves in this tiny room were filled not with clocks, but with boxes. Small wooden ones, each the size of a hand, each labeled not with a name, but with a time, 3:04 11 11 7 23 12. 200s of them. Maybe more. Aldrich stepped inside and selected a box labeled 2:36. He brought it out and placed it in the center of the table. You could feel something shift in the room as he opened it, not physically, but emotionally, because inside the box was nothing, and yet it felt full. As if it held the echo of a moment someone had once treasured so deeply that the world had made space to remember it. A quiet conversation. A goodbye that became a beginning. A glance. A breath. Aldrich didn't explain the boxes. He didn't need to. You understood. Some people collect things. Others collect moments. And Aldrich, he gave those moments a place to rest, a home. You looked. Around the room now, really looked, and you realized. This was not a shop. It was a sanctuary, a place where time didn't push forward or drag behind, where it simply curled up by the fire, sat in a worn leather chair, and whispered softly to those who would listen. And tonight, you are listening, not just with your ears, but with something deeper. The clocks around you continued their rhythm. The memory clock pulsed with a soft blue light now. The hourglass glowed faint lavender, almost finished with its cycle, and the fire began to dim. Aldrich placed the empty box back on the shelf. He closed the silent room door. He returned to his chair, now visibly more relaxed, as if the memories had breathed along with him, and for one final time that night. He spoke, but his voice was not tired. It was gentle. Time is not something we have to chase. He said, it will wait with us, if we let it. He looked toward the door, not out of urgency, but to honor the night's end, and then he closed. His eyes and the clocks still ticked, still waited, still whispered. Asu finally let go, not of the story, but of the day, of the weight behind your eyes, of the hum behind your thoughts, and into this quiet golden space. You drifted. Part 6, the room that only opened once a year morning, had not yet arrived. But the darkness outside had grown soft at the edges, that tender moment just before the sun begins to stir beneath the horizon, had arrived like a sigh, a silver hush across the rooftops, the kind of quiet that doesn't feel like emptiness, but like waiting. Inside the clockmaker's workshop, nothing had changed, and everything had. The clock still ticked, the hourglass still pulsed with its otherworldly rhythm, though the last shimmering strands of sand had nearly settled into the lower chamber, and Aldrich Everhart. He had not fallen asleep. He didn't often, not because he didn't need to, he did, but because his rest came differently than most. He rested through remembering, through stillness, through the ritual of keeping time in its gentlest form, watching it, holding it, honoring it without ever trying to command it. And on this particular night, as the hourglass neared its end, Aldrich stood once more. There was one place left to visit, one room he had not opened in nearly a year. He walked to the far side of the shop, past the fire now glowing only with embers, past the memory clock now dimly pulsing like the slow, sleepy beat of a resting heart. At the end of the hallway was a door. It was different from the others, not because of how it looked, but because of how it felt. The wood was smooth, with carvings so faint they could only be seen when light brushed them at the right angle. A spiral sun, a moon with weeping stars, and in the center, a keyhole in the shape of a flower, long since closed. Aldrich reached beneath the collar of his vest and pulled out a silver key tied to a ribbon. He paused, closed his eyes, and quietly whispered, "Let it be time." Then he turned the key. The door opened with a sound like pages being turned in a very old book. A sigh, a memory, a welcome. The room behind it was small, just big enough for a single person to step inside. It held no shelves, no clocks, no visible furniture, only light, soft, golden, like candlelight through fog. And in the center of the room was a pedestal. Atop it rested a single object, a pocket watch, but unlike any you've ever seen. Its surface shimmered like a pearl held beneath a lake. The cover was engraved not with numbers, but with words, to be opened only when time feels heavy. Aldrich looked at it with something beyond reverence. something like grief, but softer, like the kind of grief that has learned how to sit quietly beside peace. He stepped into the room and closed the door behind him. You couldn't follow. Not fully. But you could feel what happened next. Aldrich picked up the watch, pressed the small clasp with his thumb, and opened it. The sound was not mechanical. It was not even sound at all. It was feeling, a warmth that rushed through the floorboards, a soft shiver in the air, a memory that didn't belong to any one person, and yet, somehow, belonged to everyone. The room pulls once, and Aldrich, standing in that circle of golden light, whispered a name, not out loud, not for the world to hear, but for time itself. He stood there for a long while, letting the weight of the moment fill the space, letting it be heavy, letting it matter. Then, gently, he closed the watch, placed it back on the pedestal, and stepped out of the room. The door closed behind him without a sound, and the key vanished, not physically, but with the feeling that it would not be needed again until the next time time felt too heavy to carry alone. Aldrich returned to the center of the workshop. He looked older now, but not in the way people age from years. More like the way stone ages after being held in a river, softened, smoothed, still strong. He sat once again at the bench. The embers in the stove gave off the faintest warmth. The hourglass now lay still, the last grain settled. The memory clock had dimmed entirely, but remained warm to the touch. Aldrich folded his hands in front of him and lowered his head, not in prayer, not in fatigue, but in reflection. And you remained still in the leather chair by the fire, a quiet observer, a part of this world now, not just visiting, but welcomed. Perhaps your eyes were closed, perhaps your breathing had deepened, fallen into rhythm with the ticking. Perhaps you didn't even notice when your thoughts slipped away from the edges of your day and melted quietly into this timeless place. But even if you did, you knew it didn't matter, because this story wasn't about being awake. It was about being held. By memory. By stillness. By time. And Aldrich, the keeper of all of it, finally reached for his final journal, one you hadn't seen before, a deep blue book with no title on its cover. He opened to the first page. It was blank, but he began to write. Dawn is not the end of night. It is simply the moment the darkness chooses to rest. This morning, the clocks did not mark time. They marked presence. They marked the stillness of a night that asked nothing and gave everything. There was no rush, no lesson, only this, that time, when held gently, becomes not a measurement, but a place, and in that place, someone slept peacefully. Finally, he closed the book and placed it beside the memory clock, and then he smiled, a small, tired, but deeply contented smile, the kind of smile you give the last page of a book you didn't want to end, the kind of smile you give to the silence after music fades, the kind of smile that tells you you are safe, you are held, you are home. And in that final stillness, the clocks ticked on, but they no longer counted time. They simply whispered, rest. Part 7. The clock that dreamed the light of dawn had begun to gather at the edges of the world, Not the golden burst of sunlight, not yet, but the quietest beginning of morning. The kind that only those awake in the deepest hours ever truly notice. A faint lightening of the sky behind the rain clouds. A softening of shadows inside the room. A whisper in the bones that change was near, but that there was still time to stay. A little longer, inside the workshop, the fire had faded into a gentle red glow. Just embers now. Resting, not gone, Aldrich stood by the window, his hand resting lightly on the curtain as he gazed out at the damp cobblestone street. Drops of rain still clung to the glass, tracing quiet paths downward like tired thoughts making their way into sleep. And behind him, the clocks kept ticking, all of them. Together, not perfectly synchronized. Aldrich never liked perfect rhythm. It made everything too sharp, too predictable. The clocks were like voices in a choir, each singing its part softly, respectfully, letting the silence in between them do most of the work. But there was one clock that had never ticked out. It sat on a high shelf, nestled between two lanterns. You wouldn't have noticed it at first glance. Its frame was unpolished brass, slightly tarnished with age. Its face had no hands, no numbers, just a swirl like a fingerprint carved into metal. Aldrich called it the dreaming clock. He had never opened it, never tried to fix it, because it was never broken. He said it was given to him when he was young, by a traveling horologist who spoke in riddles and only stayed in town for one night. The man had said, "This one doesn't tell the time outside. It tells the time inside, the time of dreams. Wind it only when your heart feels full and your hands are still." And Aldrich had waited for decades. Tonight, at last, felt like that moment. He pulled the step stool from beneath the shelf, steadying himself gently as he reached for the old, silent piece. His fingers closed around the tarnished metal, and for a moment, he simply stood there cradling it as if it might breathe. Then he brought it to the bench. The surface of the clock felt warm, not from the fire, but from the stories in the air, the dreams it had absorbed from being near the other clocks all these years. He turned it over slowly and found a small keyhole in the base one that had been hidden for years behind a fine layer of dust. Aldrich reached into a drawer and pulled out a small velvet pouch. Inside was a single key, different from the others. It had a spiral stem and a star-shaped handle. He paused, took a breath so soft it might not have happened at all, and turned the key. At first, nothing happened. Then so gently it almost went unnoticed, the swirl on the clock's face began to glow, not shine, not flash, but glow like light beneath water. Aldrich sat back. You could feel the room hold its breath. Even the ticking seemed to hush. And then the clock began to hum. It was not mechanical. It wasn't even a sound. Really. It was a feeling, a vibration in the air, like something was stirring just beyond sight. And then the swirl moved, not like a gear, but like smoke. It began to spiral slowly. And you suddenly realized it wasn't engraved after all. It was alive. A small, dreamlike current of mist began to rise from the clock face, curling into shapes familiar and strange. A feather, a door, a wave, a hand reaching toward the sky, and then the workshop. Changed, not physically, but in presence. The clock still ticked, but their sound faded into the background, and you are no longer sitting in a chair by the fire. You are somewhere else, somewhere softer. You are walking through a forest where the trees ticked instead of rustled, where each leaf was a second, and the breeze was made of whispers. You were floating above a lake that reflected not your face, but your memories, some joyful, some forgotten, all gentle. You are surrounded by the soft colors of sleep, the shades of thought that happen between dreams' muted blues, hushed grays, pale rose gold mist that curled around your ankles and asked nothing from you but rest. The dreaming clock was not taking you anywhere. It was simply revealing where you had already been, deep within, a place your mind visits when your body sleeps, a garden where time does not walk in straight lines, where you are always safe, always held, always enough. And Aldrich, he wasn't speaking, but somehow you felt his presence here too, the way you feel warmth behind you when someone stands near, a quiet kindness, never too close, never imposing, just there, letting you explore, letting you remember, without pressure, letting you rest, without expectation, because dreams, like time, are not for solving, they are for wandering, for sitting beside, for listening to the quiet spaces in between the images, and in this dream space, you wandered through soft corridors of childhood memories, through windows of places you've never been, but still recognize, through doorways that led to nowhere. And that was perfectly fine, because here, you didn't have to go anywhere. You just had to be, and you were, for how long? Time didn't say. It never does. In dreams, and eventually, slowly, gently, you returned, not with a jolt, not with confusion, but with the sense that you had just traveled somewhere sacred, somewhere that welcomed you exactly as you are. Back in the workshop, the dreaming clock had grown dim again. The mist had faded, the swirl slowed to stillness, and Aldrich smiled, not the smile of a man who had learned something new, but the smile of a man who had witnessed someone find something they needed. And now, he placed the dreaming clock back on the shelf, its purpose complete for now. You sat quietly, hard, still, breath deep, limbs relaxed as if they had turned to light, and the workshop welcomed you back with its familiar sounds, the tick, 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 not loud, not calling, just there, like an old friend. And outside, the faintest blush of morning touched the sky. A new day was almost here, but the night had not rushed. It had unfolded, one tick at a time, into something precious. And now, you're ready to sleep, not drift, not rest lightly, but truly deeply, peacefully sleep. And Aldrich, he would stay just a little longer. Tend the clocks. Listen to the quiet. Keep the door open for the next soul who would need the gentle gift of a night like this. And the clocks whispered, you are safe, you are seen, and you are allowed to let go. Part 8. The visitor who spoke in silence at the first light of day still had not broken, but the sky had begun to stretch. It was that fragile hour when the night no longer felt infinite, and the world began to prepare itself quietly, without rush for another turn. Inside the clockmaker's shop, however, Nothing had changed, and that was the magic of it. A tea did not matter what the hour was outside. Here, time moved with you, not against you, and that was exactly how Aldrich Everhart preferred it. The dreaming clock had been returned to its high shelf, now silent once more, but with a soft golden hue that hadn't been there before. A quiet contentment like the calm. After a meaningful dream, Aldrich was sipping from a cup of warm tea. He hadn't made it recently. It had simply appeared beside him, steeped perfectly, just the way he liked it. Some things in the workshop didn't need explaining. The fire had faded to soft, pulsing coals, the hourglass had settled, and yet the room still felt awake, not with energy, but with presence, and that was when it happened. A sound. Faint. Gentle. Not a knock. Not a chime, but a shift in air. A slight pressure near the door. The kind of moment you don't notice with your ears, but with your bones. Aldrich stood. He didn't seem surprised. He walked slowly to the door and opened it, and there, standing just beyond the threshold, was a man, dressed in gray wool, simple but carefully kept. His boots were worn but clean. He had a satchel over one shoulder and a face that carried the weight of years, not in age. But in stillness, he didn't speak. He simply nodded once. Aldrich stepped aside. The man entered the shop without a sound, his footsteps as quiet as thought. You noticed something immediately. He carried no clock. He wasn't there to repair one, or deliver one, or even to remember one. He was the first visitor to come carrying only himself. He walked to the bench, looked at the memory clock, then at the stool beside it, and sat. Aldrich didn't ask a question. He didn't need to, because sometimes silence is the story, and this man had arrived full of it, the kind of silence that comes after a long walk, after a goodbye, after waiting so long for something that it no longer needs to arrive. Aldrich poured him a cup of tea from the kettle. The man accepted it with a nod. They sat like that for some time. No words, just shared quiet, and you felt it not as a pause in the story, but as its most important part, because not all stories are told in paragraphs. Some are told in presence, eventually. The man reached into his satchel. He did not pull out a journal or an heirloom or a broken timepiece. He pulled out a single feather, long, ivory white with a silver line down the center. He placed it gently on the table, then looked to Aldrich, and Aldrich nodded. You saw the understanding pass between them, even though not a word was exchanged. Aldrich stood and reached for a small wooden box beneath the bench. He opened it slowly, carefully, like it had not been opened in years. Inside were feathers, dozens of them, all different, one deep crimson, one with a pattern like a fingerprint, one translucent, as if made of smoke. He added the new feather to the collection, closed the box, and placed it on the shelf labeled, "Things that arrive when people are ready." The man exhaled through his nose. Not a sigh, just a release. He looked around the shop slowly, as if committing every corner to memory. The shelves, the soft light, the hourglass, the cat-shaped clock, the fire. Then, with a small smile barely more than a crease at the edge of his lips, he stood. Aldrich stood too. The two men looked at each other, and without needing a farewell, The visitor walked back toward the door. Before he left, he paused for a moment and turned back. He lifted a finger, not pointing at anything, just lifting it gently in the air, as if saying, "Thank you for holding the silence." And Aldrich gave a slow bow of his head, saying, "Always," and then the man was gone. In no sound, in no trace, just a new lightness in the air. You felt it too, a strange kind of peace. Not because something had happened, but because nothing needed to. The moment had been its own purpose, and now Aldrich walked to the shelf where the wooden box of feathers sat. He touched the lid and whispered, mostly to himself, "Not all visitors come for time. Some come to return pieces of themselves they didn't know they'd lost." He turned back toward the center of the shop. The memory clock had resumed its faint glow. The hourglass remained still, but something in the workshop felt changed, a presence perhaps, or an absence finally settled. Aldrich returned to the bench and opened his journal, not the one for forgotten time, not the dreaming one, but a fourth journal bound in slate blue leather, with a clasp that clicked open like a breath catching in your throat. He began to write. Tonight, the story was told. In silence, a feather, a cup of tea, and a moment held open. Not all healing comes through fixing. Not all clocks are broken. Some are simply waiting for a quiet enough space to let their own rhythm return. He set the journal down and stood again. For a long moment, he stood in the very center of the room, surrounded by clocks. Soft light, dreams, silence, time, and you realized something. You had never felt more still, more welcome, more part of something ancient and quiet and full of meaning. And as your breath slowed, as the warmth of the chair surrounded you like a familiar quilt, as the fire whispered its final ember into rest, you let go of thought, of expectation, of the shape of the day that had come before, and into that gentle void. You fell, not downward, but inward, into sleep, not rushed, but earned. Aldrich smiled once more, and the clocks all around you ticked softly, steadily, like heartbeats in a dream. Part 9. The bell that never rang it was just past the edge of night now. The sky outside had turned the faintest blue like ink washed with water, still heavy with the memory of darkness, but beginning to admit the idea of morning. And yet, inside the clockmaker's workshop, the world remained unchanged. The fire had faded to soft ash. The hourglass had completed its cycle. The dreaming clock was quiet once more. The memory clock pulsed low and steady, like the rhythm of a sleeping breath. Aldrich stood in the center of the room with both hands gently resting behind his back. His gaze swept across the shelves, not counting, not checking, but remembering. Each piece had a name, not the kind written in a ledger, but the kind carried in silence. There was the metronome that used to sit in a music teacher's attic, the little rose gold watch a bride forgot to wear on her wedding day, the wind-up toy shaped like a rabbit that hadn't moved since 1976, but no one minded. And there, on the topmost shelf near the northern wall, was the bell that never rang. He had always been there, even before the shelves, even before Aldrich. No one remembered where it came from, and no one remembered it ever making a sound. It was small, made of deep green glass with flecks of gold trapped inside, like someone had poured stardust into a bottle and forgotten to seal it. In a clapper inside. In a rope or pull string, and yet people always noticed it, not when they entered, but when they left. Aldrich would see it in their eyes. Just before they stepped out of the workshop, they would glance upward as if something invisible had stirred the air. Their shoulders would soften. Their breathing would deepen. A feeling would pass over them like the hush of snowfall, and Aldrich knew the bell had rung for them. Not out loud, not with sound, but with meaning. It was said that the green bell only sounded when something within a visitor had shifted, when something unspoken had finally been acknowledged, released, healed, or remembered. And on this particular morning, just as Aldrich turned back toward the bench, the bell shimmered, not visibly, but inwardly. Something had changed, and Aldrich smiled. He didn't speak. He didn't reach for his journal. He simply turned out the last lamp, one by one. The memory clock dimmed. The clocks all continued ticking, and the workshop glowed, not from the fire, not from the lamps, but from the soft accumulation of everything that had passed during the night. Each breath, each pause, each held silence, each whisper of grief, peace, gratitude, and stillness. It all remained here, like dust made of memory, and you were still with him. Your breathing had long since slowed. Your thoughts had stopped moving like sentences, and had become impressions, shapes, softness, colors you didn't need to name, but something in your soul heard the bell. Too, even if you couldn't say when. Maybe it rang when you let go of a worry you didn't realize you were holding. Maybe it rang when you allowed yourself to simply sit still. Maybe it rang just now, when you realized this story had no lesson, only a place, and it was this place, a quiet, time-worn sanctuary where healing doesn't shout. It whispers. Aldrich reached once more for the feather box. He didn't open it. He just touched it. A small act, but enough. He walked slowly to the window and pushed the curtain aside. The first threads of morning light stretched between the rooftops. Pale gold. Not brilliant. Not dramatic, but tender. He stood for a while, the way one might stand beside a sleeping friend, and you could feel it. That this night had been a living thing. It had listened to you, cradled you, watched over you, and now it was ready to pass the baton to the day, but there was no rush. The clocks would stay, the feather box would stay, the journals would remain closed until another story needed to be written, and Aldrich would rest, not in a bed, not behind a door, but right there, in his worn leather chair by the cold fire, head tilted slightly back, hands folded on his lap, peaceful. Still, he had done what he always did. He had held the time for someone who needed it. And you drifted softly into the space beyond the story, not empty, not forgotten, but full of softness, of warmth, of something old and familiar that didn't need to be named. And as your body fell deeper into sleep, as your mind settled into its most delicate rhythm, the bell that never rang once more inside you, a quiet bell that didn't call you to wake, but blessed you as you slept. Part 10. The key without a lock the morning had finally arrived, but not in the way most mornings do. There were no loud birdsong choruses, no sharp beams of sunlight slicing through the curtains. The world outside remained wrapped in mist, like the sky had woken up slowly. And politely, inside the clockmaker's workshop, the silence was even softer now. As if the night had not truly ended, but simply shifted into another form, like tea becoming steam, or candlelight turning to memory. Aldrich. Everhart remained seated by the stove, where the last coal had long since gone out. His hands rested gently on his lap, one atop the other. His eyes were closed, but not from sleep. He was listening, not to clocks, not to footsteps, but to stillness. Stillness had always been his companion. It was not emptiness to him. It was not the absence of something. It was the presence of everything, without noise, and in that stillness, something stirred beneath the floor. And no sound, just a feeling, a pressure, a warmth, a presence he had not sensed in many, many years. He opened his eyes and looked toward the corner of the shop, toward a section of floorboards so worn they had turned silver gray. He stood slowly, stretching as though he were uncurling from the night itself, and walked over. He knelt, and with a gentle movement of his fingers, he pressed one specific knot in the wood. Click, the board lifted. Inside, wrapped in blue cloth, was a key, long, unusually shaped. Not brass, not iron. It shimmered faintly, like it had been forged from moonlight and memory. Aldrich held it in both hands. He turned it over once, twice, then he smiled, soft, familiar, as if greeting an old friend. The key without a lock. It had been given to him when he was just a boy, passed down through 3 generations of Everhart clockmakers. And each time, the same words were spoken. Keep this safe. One day, someone will arrive who already carries the lock, and they will not know it until you hand them this key. He had waited over 60 years, and now he felt it, not certainty, but knowing, like the faint scent of a coming storm, or the quiet pull of a forgotten tune returning to your lips. He wrapped the key once more and placed it gently in his coat pocket. Then he walked toward the door, not quickly, just with purpose. Outside, the mist swirled like a dream, just starting to dissolve at the edges. The street was empty. The lanterns had gone out, but the light now made the cobblestones glow silver. He didn't step outside. He simply opened the door and waited. Minutes passed, maybe more, and then a figure appeared, not from the distance, not from the side street, but from the mist itself. They walked slowly, hesitantly, as if unsure whether the road beneath them would hold. Their coat was too light for the morning chill. Their hair clung to the dampness in the air. Their eyes, tired, not from lack of sleep, but from carrying something invisible. They paused at the door, looked at Aldrich, then looked beyond him, into the warm, clock-filled sanctuary behind, and without a word, Aldrich stepped aside. The visitor entered. You couldn't tell if they were young or old, grieving or remembering, searching or simply lost. They were all of those things, and none of them. They walked past the memory clock, which pulls gently in. Recognition. They passed the fireless stove, The hourglass, now still again. The bell that never rang, quiet as ever. They stood in the center of the room, and for a long, long while. They said nothing. Aldrich didn't move. He watched, and when the moment was right, when the air felt just soft enough, just quiet enough, he reached into his pocket and offered the key. The visitor looked at it, then at him, then at the key again. They didn't take it, not immediately, but their hand lifted, trembling just slightly, and closed around it. The moment they did, something shifted, not in the room, but in them. Their shoulders softened, their breath deepened, their eyes glistened, and somewhere inside where locks are kept that no one ever talks about, something turned, something opened, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, a quiet release, a door swinging open that had never had a name. They looked down at the key in their palm, then up at Aldrich, and he, of course, said only one thing: welcome. They stayed for hours. No clock was repaired. No journal written in. No question asked. They simply sat in the warmth of the shop, letting the tick of time hold them, letting presence be enough. And when they finally stood to leave, they looked once more at the green glass bell on the high shelf. And no sound came, but the smile on their face told Aldrich everything he needed to know. And as the door closed softly behind them, the key remained in their hand, and it would never be just a key again. It would be a reminder that somewhere in the world there had been a place where time had waited, where stillness had welcomed them, where a door had opened, and the lock had finally turned. Aldrich stood alone again, but not empty. He returned to the center of the shop and opened one final drawer. Inside, a blank piece of paper. He began to write. Today, someone arrived, not knowing they were looking for anything, but the lock inside them was ready. And when the key met it quietly, gently it turned. This is what we do. We keep time. We hold space. And we wait for the ones who are ready to remember that they were never broken, just waiting. He folded the paper and placed it in a glass jar on the windowsill. The jar held no label, but inside it were dozens more like it. Unsent letters, unspoken thoughts, moments that didn't need to be read to be real. They just needed to exist. And now, you too could rest. The story had no ending, only a pause, because stories like this one don't conclude, they continue. Every time someone closes their eyes and finds the workshop again. In memory. In dreams. In breath. And as the clocks around, you ticked in their gentle harmony. You knew there would always be a place where the door was slightly open, where the tea stayed warm, where the silence spoke kindly, and where time waited just for you. Part 11. The watch that only ticked in the rainth shop was still again. The visitor had left. The door had closed without a sound. And the quiet that followed wasn't empty, it was full. Full of what had passed, what had opened, and what had softened. Aldrich moved gently through the space. He didn't rush to tidy the table, didn't scribble a note, didn't start his next task. He just walked, letting the silence breathe, letting the workshop settle back into itself. And then, without really deciding to, he made his way to the tall wooden cabinet at the back of the room. One of its doors had a small brass plaque, so faded you could barely read the words. Pieces that only work sometimes. He opened it slowly. Inside were shelves of strange, quiet things, a compass with no needle, a wind-up cat that only moved when no one was watching, a pair of reading glasses that occasionally showed memories instead of text, and on the second shelf, sitting in a shallow velvet-lined box, was a small silver pocket watch, dull in color, a little scratched, plain almost, except for the tiniest engraving on its back, a single word, rain. Aldrich picked it up. He didn't wind it, didn't shake it, didn't try to open the face. He simply stood by the window and waited outside. The early morning light was pale, almost blue. Mist drifted like slow breath through the empty streets, brushing against the windows and gutters like fingers on glass. And then, faintly, a drop, then another. Rain had returned, not heavy, not loud, but enough. And as soon as the first string of raindrops tapped gently against the glass, like fingers drumming the edge of a piano, the silver watch in Aldrich's palm gave a single soft tick, then another, then another. He smiled. The rain watch was never broken. It simply had its own rhythm. It only ticked when the world outside cried gently. And no one knew who made it. It had arrived one night in a plain envelope, slipped through the mail slot like a forgotten letter from a friend who never left a return address, and for years Aldrich had kept it on the shelf, never sold it, never studied it. He just listened, and on rainy mornings like this one, he would bring it out, hold it in his palm, and sit beside the window because the rain watch wasn't made to tell time. It was made to match it. To remind the listener that some moments weren't measured in hours or minutes, but in mood. In softness. In the way the world sometimes slowed. Just enough to be felt. Aldrich sat in his chair with the rain watch gently ticking in his hand, watching droplets race each other down the pane. His breathing matched the rhythm, and you too could feel it, that slow sync between inside and outside, between breath and window pane, between your pulse and the ticking in Aldrich's hand. The rain outside spoke of nothing urgent. And no thunder, no rush, just a light, steady hush over the city, a blanket, a memory. And it was then that Aldrich did something he had not done for many years. He opened the watch, not the outer case. He had done that many times, but this time, something was different. This time, when he pressed the small release switch beneath the dial, a hidden hinge on the back popped open, revealing a secret compartment. Inside was paper, soft, aged, folded with great care. He lifted it. It was thin, translucent, almost glowing with time. He unfolded it slowly. It wasn't a letter. It was a sketch, a woman, sitting beside a window, holding a watch in one hand and a teacup in the other. She was older, but not elderly. Her hair was pulled back. Her eyes were soft and focused on the rain. Her posture said, "I am here." "That's enough." Aldrich stared at it for a long moment, then turned it over. In small handwriting on the back, it read, "For the mornings when I'm not there, but the rain is." He didn't cry. He didn't speak, but something passed across his face, a soft, almost imperceptible shift, recognition, not of grief, not of longing, but of gratitude, because true time is not about permanence. It is about presence. And here, in the quiet rainlight of a new day, Aldrich was present. Fully, he placed the paper back into the compartment, clicked the watch, shut, and held it in both hands for a while longer. It ticked gently. In no urgency. No countdown. Just gentle, measured patience. Eventually, he stood and returned it to its velvet-lined box. He didn't put it back in the cabinet. Not today. Today. He left it out on the windowsill, because sometimes things are meant to be seen, not examined, just seen. And you remained in your warm chair. The rain's rhythm outside matched the slowing of your thoughts, and you realized this story is not asking anything of you. It's not building toward a grand ending. It's not teaching a lesson. It's simply sitting beside you, being with you, the way Aldrich sat with the rain watch, the way the clocks ticked without asking to be wound, the way memory curls itself into the corners of quiet places. So you can finally rest. And as the rain watch ticked once more, you let it lull you into that place between breath and dream, between waking and sleep, where nothing is required of you, except that you simply be, and the clocks will take care of the rest. Part 12, The Hour That Was Missing. Rain continued, not as a storm, not with drama, but as something softer. A hush that smoothed the rooftops. A kindness falling from the sky. Inside the shop, the ticking of clocks had returned to its gentle presence. Like breathing, like background music you only notice when it stops. They weren't there to remind anyone of time passing. They were just there. Aldrich stood near the center of the room, slowly polishing the glass face of a small desk clock shaped like a seashell. The cloth moved in slow, wide circles across the curve of the glass. His focus was soft, not rushed, not distracted, just present. It was then that he noticed it, not in the clock he was holding, but in the air, a faint irregularity, a subtle tremble in the room's rhythm. The ticking hadn't stopped, but something wasn't there. A moment, a beat, a tiny breath between seconds. Aldrich paused, then walked quietly toward the wall where the shop's longest clock was kept. It was a floor-to-ceiling timepiece carved from driftwood, with metal inlays that shimmered silver in moonlight. The kind of clock that didn't just count hours, it remembered them. He opened the glass door, listened. Tick, tick, tick. But something was off. One of the hours was missing. Not the number, not the hand, but the presence between 3 and 4. There was nothing, not a mistake, not damage, just a soft, clean absence. Aldrich tilted his head and smiled gently. He had heard of this before. Some clocks, especially those old enough, quiet enough, loved enough, would sometimes stop counting a specific hour, if that hour had been lost, not in time, but in memory. He stepped back and turned to the tall cabinet against the far wall, the one few visitors ever noticed. It was painted gray, with a faded handle shaped like a sleeping cat. On the top shelf, under a box labeled Incomplete Hours, was a small stack of notebooks wrapped in cloth. He pulled one down and opened it. Each page listed an hour: 4, 12, 6, 01, 10, 47, 1, 03, and next to each, a small note: forgotten goodbye. Letter never sent. Held breath in hospital room. The hour he didn't say it back. Aldrich added a new one. 3:28 the hour she left. And I pretended not to watch her go. He stared at the page, not out of sorrow, but out of acknowledgement. Sometimes we lose an hour, not because it slips away, but because we choose to look the other way when it arrives, a memory we're not ready to meet, a feeling we don't know how to hold, a truth we don't have language for, and time, like a quiet companion, respects that .it steps around the moment, lets it be, but in certain places gentle. Places, like Aldrich's shop, those hours eventually return, not loudly. Not all at once, but with the rain, with the soft clink of porcelain, with the weight of a key in the palm, with the glow of a memory clock on a quiet shelf. Aldrich closed the book and returned it to the cabinet. He turned back toward the room where the clocks continued their rhythm, and there just faintly he heard it, a single tick, right between 3 and 4. The missing hour had returned. He smiled. The shop had held space for it. No fixing, no forcing, just holding, and it had come back when it was ready. He walked to the table and sat once again in the leather chair. The rain watch still ticked gently on the windowsill. The bell that never rang shimmered faintly in the soft gray light. You felt, it too, that something had settled. That something unspoken had been gently welcomed home, and as your body grew heavier, as your thoughts began to move like fog drifting over quiet streets, you let your own missing hour come closer, not to relive it, not to explain it, but just to let it sit beside you without judgment, without urgency, because here, in this shop, every part of you is welcome, even the moments you forgot to carry, even the hours you skipped, or avoided, or buried. They too have a place here, and they will return to you when they're ready. Until then, the clocks will remember them, and the rain will keep time, and you can sleep. Part 13, the parcel with no name be now. The rain had quieted into the softest version of itself, not even a pattern, just a presence. A hush that drifted through the misty air, like an old song you only remember when the world becomes quiet. Enough to hear it. Aldrich moved through the shop like the hour itself, calm, measured, without hurry. He had just finished placing the rain watch back inside its velvet-lined box. The window beside it bore the gentle marks of the weather, small beads of water clinging to the glass, like thoughts that had not yet fallen into dreams. The clocks were ticking in a perfect sort of imperfection, some fast, some slow, some pausing, just long enough to remind you that time wasn't a straight line. It was a dance, and today it waltzed. That's when the sound came, a small thump, soft but certain, just outside the door. Aldrich turned, not startled, but curious. He walked across the wooden floor, each step quiet as snowfall, and opened the shop door. No one was there. The street beyond was empty, the sky pale, the stones damp, but at his feet was a parcel wrapped in brown paper, tied with plain string, and bearing no name. No address, no note, no return marking, just presence. He bent down slowly and lifted it. It was light, but not empty, the way a letter can feel light in the hand, But heavy in the heart, he brought it inside and placed it gently on the center workbench. You watched from your warm chair by the fire, your limbs too soft to move, your breath too slow to speak. But your mind calm, quiet, half asleep was. Still listening, still part of this story, Aldrich untied the string with careful fingers, then unwrapped the paper. Inside was a clock, but unlike any he had ever seen. A T was made entirely of wood, no metal, no glass. The kind of dark wood that smelled faintly of cedar and wind. Its face bore no numbers, no hands, no markings, just a single thin groove spiraling inward. Like the rings of a tree, he turned it gently in his hands. On the underside was a simple carving. Returned to silence, Aldrich sat down. He looked at the clock for a long while, then reached for a notebook, one of the older ones, its corners frayed. Like leaves at the end of a season, he opened it to the first blank page and wrote, "A new arrival today. A gift from the unseen. It ticks without moving. It marks nothing, but holds everything. I do not know where it belongs, but it does not feel lost. It feels complete." He placed the wooden clock on a small round cushion beside the bell that never rang. Then he leaned back and folded his hands in his lap, and the room somehow grew even quieter, because some things don't need to make sound to be heard. Some clocks don't need hands to hold time. Some gifts don't need names to know they are home. And you, listening from across the room, felt something settle in your chest. Not a thought, not a memory, just a release, a softness. Like laying down something you didn't realize you'd been carrying. The kind of moment that asks nothing of you, except that you simply let it be. Aldrich closed his eyes. You did too. And the shop held all of it. The ticking, the hush, the parcel, the questions, the presence of things that didn't need answers. And the clocks whispered, even the things you don't understand are still welcome. Part 14. The wall that wasn't always the red wooden clock sat quietly beside the bell that never rang. It didn't tick, didn't hum, didn't chime, and yet it filled the shop with a kind of weightless presence, as though it were not keeping time, but absorbing it, like a sponge for forgotten moments, or a nest built out of hours that had never fully arrived. Aldrich sat in stillness. He hadn't moved in quite some time, not because he was asleep, though his breathing had slowed to a dreamlike rhythm, but because stillness was, to him, a kind of listening, and something was calling, not loudly, not from outside, from within. The shop itself. He opened his eyes and turned toward the eastern wall, the one behind the collection of cuckoo clocks. The wall had always been there, or so he thought. But tonight, something felt strange. He stood and walked slowly toward it, his fingertips brushing against the wooden frames of the clocks as he passed. Most of them were still. A few gave the occasional coo, softly and out of rhythm, like birds talking in their sleep. When he reached the wall, he paused. He looked at the old wallpaper, worn, floral, pale blue with curling corners. And then, without truly deciding to, he reached forward and peeled a section of it back. Beneath it was not wood, not brick, but glass, a pane of it, thick, Cloudy.as if a window had been built there long ago, and then forgotten, buried behind years of plaster and paper and clocks. He pressed his palm against it, cold, but not lifeless. He looked closer and saw nothing, not the outside street, not another room, just mist. Swirling gently on the other side, he stepped back and whispered to himself, "I don't remember building this," and he didn't, because he hadn't. He reached for a lamp and tilted its glow toward the glass. Something flickered, not a reflection, not a shadow, a shape. He stepped closer again, and as he looked into the fog, something began to form, slowly, softly, like a memory rebuilding itself, a figure, faint, blurred, but unmistakable. It wasn't frightening. It was familiar, not someone Aldrich could name, but someone he knew. They stood on the other side of the glass, unmoving. Their posture was calm. Their hands rested at their sides. Their face, patient. Aldrich didn't speak. He didn't need to. He had seen this before, not here, not in this place, but in dreams. In the kind of dreams that feel older than you are, the kind that feel borrowed. He reached out slowly and placed both hands on the glass. The figure on the other side did the same. For a moment longer than a breath, shorter than a minute, they simply stood together, separated by time, space, or something stranger. And then the glass began to fog, not from the inside, from between. As if the wall itself was exhaling when the mist cleared. The figure was gone, but Aldrich remained still, and behind him, you sat in your chair, eyes heavy, mind quiet, heart strangely open. You felt the shift, too, that something deep within the shop had stirred, not woken, just turned. Like a page, Aldrich returned to the bench and reached for the slate-blue journal. He opened to a fresh page and wrote. The wall was not always there. Perhaps the shop grew it to protect something, or to remember something I chose to forget. I saw them again, not in shadow, not in story, just standing. We said nothing, and still everything was said. He closed the book and ran his fingers along its spine. Outside, the rain had stopped completely, and for the first time all night, the clouds parted slightly, just enough to let a strip of pale morning light stretch across the windowsill. It kissed the wooden clock, touched the glass wall, slid across your sleeping form in the chair, and the clocks, all of them, held their breath for one brief moment. The shop was completely silent. No ticking, no wind, no whisper, just light and presence and rest. And in that hush, the story reminded you gently that silence is not the absence of sound. It is the return to something more ancient, more intimate, a place where the soul can unclench, where the body no longer needs to hold shape, where the clockmaker no longer needs to count, only to witness. And so Aldrich folded his hands in his lap. Once more, the light shifted again. The clouds slowly returned, and the clocks resumed their rhythm. Su let go, deeper, further, into sleep, the kind of sleep that isn't for forgetting, but for remembering the parts of yourself that have been waiting quietly for you to arrive. Part 15, the drawer marked "Not Yet," after the glass wall faded back into stillness. After the morning, light drifted away again, quiet and pale, and after the clocks returned to their soft ticking rhythm, Eldrick rose from his chair once more. His movements now were slower than before, not because he was tired, but because the moment called for it. He knew this rhythm. The shop had entered a different phase of the night. It wasn't the beginning, when stories unfolded like parchment across the workbench. It wasn't the middle, when memories stirred in clocks and feathers and quiet strangers. This was the after, a place not of events, but of meaning, a time when nothing new appeared, but everything became clear. Eldrick walked toward the back of the workshop, past the tall cabinet where he kept incomplete timepieces, past the velvet-lined drawers of feather clocks and silent hours. He stopped at a small chest of drawers tucked into the corner of a shelf almost no one ever noticed. It was simple, unpolished, worn smooth by years of quiet contact. Each drawer was labeled with faint words, carved by hand so delicately they could be mistaken for scratches. Most were easy to understand: given, kept, returned, left behind. But there was one drawer, low to the floor, tucked in the very bottom, labeled "Not Yet." Eldrick knelt. He placed one hand on the cool wood, let it rest there for a few long seconds, like he was asking permission. Then, slowly, he opened it. The drawer slid out noiselessly, revealing what appeared to be an assortment of unassembled clock parts, but they were unlike any others. And O2 matched: a brass hand with no face, a porcelain numeral with no clock, a ring of glass cracked in half but shining with gold along the break, a key with no slot. Eldrick looked at them the way a gardener might look at flower bulbs beneath snow. Not useless, not broken, just waiting. He reached in and pulled out one piece, a thin, crescent-shaped bit of metal etched with a name. Not a person's name, but a feeling, hope. He held it gently in his palm, let its weight settle, and then placed it on the table. One by one, he brought out a few more: a gear engraved with a child's drawing of a star, a ribbon that once belonged to a woman who whispered secrets to her kitchen. Clock, a smooth stone that pulsed barely when rain fell, a second hand that moved in reverse, but only when you were telling the truth. Each piece didn't fit into any known clock. Each belonged to a moment that hadn't happened yet, because the "not yet" drawer wasn't a storage place. It was a promise, a quiet agreement between time and patience. Eldrick often opened this drawer late at night, not to fix anything, not even to understand, but to remember that not all moments come when we expect them. Some moments arrive long after we've stopped looking. Some arrive in sleep, some in silence, some in the ticking between breaths, and some not at all, but they're no less real. He placed the crescent-shaped hope piece on the table beside the others, then lit a small candle, not for light, but for acknowledgement. The flame flickered. You watched it from across the room, eyes half closed, your body entirely still. The air was thick with warmth and old wood, and something else you couldn't name, but didn't need to. You didn't need to do anything. You just needed to be here, because here, everything was allowed to wait, every feeling, every question, every part of you that wasn't ready before. Aldrich looked at the objects on the table as though he were greeting them, not for the first time, not for the last, but just for now. Then he whispered, not to you, not to himself, but perhaps to time. Some things are worth keeping, even if they aren't ready yet. He reached for the candle and gently snuffed it out. The smoke curled upward, faded into the ceiling, and the drawer slid closed again on its own. As if it knew. As if it understood the importance of not yet. Aldrich stood, his hand brushing the top of the chest once more, then turned back to you. You hadn't spoken. You hadn't moved. But your presence filled the room like a quiet yes, because something in you understood it too. The drawer, the waiting, the pieces of yourself you hadn't quite assembled yet. They weren't gone. They were just not yet. And that was enough. The shop hummed softly in the background. The clocks ticked without rush, and the green bell remained quiet, though somehow you knew it had seen the moment, held it, honored it, and you felt something inside your chest settle, a permission you didn't know you were waiting for, a space made for what had no name, a soft folding in, like rest, true rest, the kind where nothing is asked of you, where even your memories are invited to sleep, and in that warmth you drifted, not to escape, but to be held in the quiet drawer of your own soul. That says only, not yet, but still. Here. Part 16. The night. The pendulum stood still. Aldrich had returned to his chair. The clocks, for the most part, continued their steady, irregular rhythm. Some ticked quietly, others gave the faintest creak with each sway. The shop's warmth had grown deeper, not in heat, but in stillness, like a library that remembered every word ever whispered inside it. And then it happened, subtle, instant, unmistakable, one by one. The pendulums stopped, not with a dramatic halt. They simply paused, mid-swing. First, the grandfather clock near the window, then the golden sun clock above the stove, then the metronome on the back shelf, then the ones tucked behind cabinets, above doors, inside drawers, all of them. Still, ticking continued, but the swinging, that visual heartbeat of time had stilled. Aldrich noticed immediately. He didn't move. He just looked up. He had lived long enough to know when something rare had entered the room. This was not a mechanical failure. This was a moment so still. Even time itself had chosen to sit down and breathe. He rose slowly from the chair, walked quietly past the rain watch, the memory clock, the hidden wall of glass. He passed the parcel with no name, the shelf of feathers, the bell that almost rang. He stopped at the middle of the room where the spiral rug marked the exact center of the workshop, though few ever noticed, and there he simply waited, not in expectation, but in recognition, and in the quiet that followed. You felt it too. Something had shifted. You didn't know what, but your breath moved more deeply into your chest. The back of your body sank further into the softness of the chair, and your thoughts, those final, floating ones that still whispered at the edge of sleep, fell silent. A tea was as though the room had become a still pool, and anything that entered would simply float. And no effort, no sinking, Just weightless being, the pendulums hung at angles not frozen, not broken, just paused, as if they had all agreed, without words, to rest at once. Aldrich walked to the slate blue journal. He opened it to a blank page, and though he had not touched a pen yet, the words arrived. Tonight, even the heartbeat of the clocks is stilled, the air holds its breath. Not in fear, but in reverence. This is not a pause between tasks. It is a pause between stories. Something is ending, or beginning, or remembering how to be both. He paused, then added, and all that is asked of us is to sit still and let it happen. He set the journal down and did just that. He sat back in his leather chair, and the pendulums remained still, and yet the world did not feel broken. It felt whole, like this moment, this shared quiet between Clockmaker workshop and you, was a kind of sleep the universe needed, a sleep that required no closing of eyes, just a soft releasing of everything else. The clocks did not tick louder to compensate. They respected the stillness. As did the room. As did the rain, now gone entirely, leaving only silver clouds and soft light beyond the windows. As did you, because in this suspended moment, this place where time no longer moved forward or back, you felt more present than you had in a long, long time, and in that presence, sleep no longer felt like leaving something behind, but like returning to something ancient, something soft, something that had always waited for you beneath the tick and swing of every day. Aldrich leaned back, eyes half closed. His fingers rested gently on the arm of the chair. He had no plans to wind anything. Not tonight. Tonight was not for winding. It was for listening to the sound of the pendulums. Not swinging, but waiting, just like the rest of the story, just like the stars behind the clouds, just like you, gently slipping now into the deepest part of rest, the part where nothing needs to be fixed, the part where even time agrees we all deserve to stop swinging sometimes. Part 17. The time that belonged to no one. Pendulums had not resumed their swing, and yet nothing felt wrong. If anything, the absence of motion had become a kind of presence in itself, as if time had taken its shoes off and curled up in the corner to rest beside you. The shop was quieter now than it had ever been. Not hollow, not empty, just complete, like an exhale that had no hurry to end. Aldrich had not moved in a long while. He didn't need to. The moment held him just as gently as the leather chair beneath him. The clocks ticked, softly, slowly, but without punctuation, without the punctuation of swinging pendulums. Time lost its cadence. It became something more fluid, less measured, more felt. Aldrich's eyes opened slowly, not fully, just enough to remind the room he was still here, that he did something he hadn't done in years. He stood, walked past the memory clock, past the blue feathered metronome, past the sleeping stove, and reached for the key cabinet, the one very few people ever noticed. A tea hung beside the window, shaped like a small cathedral. Its doors were carved with vines and quiet suns. Inside were dozens of hooks, each with a key. Some were brass, some iron, some carved of bone or even stone. None were labeled. Aldrich scanned the rows with a practiced eye, then reached for one in the far corner. It was small, simple, made of dark wood and copper. You might have mistaken it for a drawer key, or the kind used for an old jewelry box, but Eldrick knew exactly what it opened. He walked to the back of the workshop, to a wall no one ever touched, not because it was hidden, but because it was quiet. People often forget quiet things are there. He knelt, reached under the bottom shelf, and found a small hatch in the floor. He placed the key inside and turned it. Click. The floor opened like a whisper. Inside was a box, wrapped in black cloth. He lifted it gently and set it on the bench. He didn't unwrap it right away. He just looked at it. As if the act of seeing it, of remembering that it existed, was already part of the ritual. You, half asleep, watched from your corner, and even though your body had grown soft and distant, something in you leaned in, something in you recognized this, the moment, the presence. The way time seemed to slow even further, until it no longer felt like time at all. Eldrick unfolded the black cloth. Inside the box was a watch, not a pocket watch, not a wall clock. Something in between. It had no strap, no chain, just a smooth, circular body and a face that reflected nothing like a polished stone. On its surface were no numbers, no hands, no ticking, just light, soft, slow light, moving. Inside, Eldrick didn't touch it. He simply sat and looked, because this was the time that belonged to no one. It wasn't kept on schedules, wasn't printed in calendars, couldn't be measured in sleep cycles or sunrise. This was deep time, the kind that lives in tree rings, the kind found at the bottom of oceans, the kind that flows in and out of dreams without asking permission. He opened his journal and didn't write, just let the page be open, because even paper sometimes needs a moment to breathe. And as you sat there, or maybe now, you are lying with your body fully surrendered to rest. You too felt it. This part of the story wasn't being told in words. It was being told in presence, a story that didn't need to be understood, only felt. Eldrick eventually placed the watch back into its cloth, closed the box, returned it to the floor, and locked it again, not to hide it, but to protect it. To remind himself that not all time is meant to be held. Some is simply meant to visit. To pass through us, like soft wind. To rock us to sleep, not by counting, but by cradling. As he stood and turned back toward the shop, everything remained quiet, still, timeless, and somehow so completely alive. The pendulums still had not moved. The clocks continued their slow, tender work. And you were now deep within that sacred, silent hour that belongs to no one but you, where the world asks nothing, where memories become gentle, where you are allowed to float, weightless, held, safe, not because anything has been solved, but because nothing needs to be. And in this place, time is not a line. It is a room where someone left the door open for you, and all you had to do was step in and sleep. Part 18. The dust that remembered nothing had moved for a long while. Not the pendulums, not the green bell, not even the fire, which now held only the soft memory of flame in the shape of curling smoke. And still, the shop breathed, not in sound, not in light, but in presence. A tea was in the way the dust gently floated through the air, not stirred, not hurried, but drifting like it had always been part of the story. Aldrich sat quietly at the table. He had not lit a lamp. He didn't need to. The room glowed with its own kind of light now, the kind that doesn't come from flame or bulb, but from something far older, memory, not the loud kind. Not the kind you chase, but the kind that lives in the dust dot, in the spaces beneath shelves, in the curves of worn wood, in the air between ticking and silence. Aldrich watched the dust move through a shaft of morning light. Then he whispered aloud, not for anyone else to hear, but simply because some thoughts deserve a voice. Dust only gathers when something has stayed long enough to be remembered. He stood and walked slowly to the cabinet near the back, the one few ever noticed, because it didn't shine or creak or call attention to itself. It was labeled. Held. Inside were only objects that had not been used in years, not because they were forgotten, but because they didn't need to be touched to be loved. There was a teacup with a crack shaped like a crescent moon, a coin from a country that never existed, a map with no destination, only the words, where you paused longest is where you are, and there, tucked in the corner, was an old, dust-covered hourglass, not like the glowing one you've seen before. This one was closed, sealed at both ends with wax. No sand passed through. No time moved, but Aldrich didn't need it to measure anything. He lifted it gently and brought it to the table. He set it down beside the soft journal, beside the feather box, beside the key with no door. He didn't open it. He didn't try. Instead, he took a soft brush from the drawer and began gently removing the dust, stroke by slow stroke. The bristles didn't just sweep it away. They revealed a carving on the base of the hourglass. Almost hidden. It read, I am not running out. I am waiting. Aldrich stopped brushing. He let the moment rest, because he knew what this meant. There are kinds of time that live beneath what we measure, time that doesn't tick forward, time that isn't about goals or deadlines or plans, time that is simply being, time that dust remembers, because dust doesn't settle where there is chaos. A tea settles where there is stillness, where things have come to rest, where stories have paused, where breathing has slowed enough for silence to become the main character. And in that dust, time stops being something that chases you. A tea becomes something that holds you. You felt it too, not as a thought, but as warmth, somewhere beneath your ribs. In the hollow behind your knees. In the soft fold of your fingers as your hand rested still and open. You are no longer thinking. You are no longer drifting. You are being remembered. By a room that had seen stories before yours, by air that had held thousands of silent hours, by the dust that had rested on every letter never sent, every clock never wound, every secret never spoken aloud. Aldrich placed the hourglass down, didn't seal it away again. He simply let it stay. There, a reminder that you do not need to be in motion to matter. You do not need to be measuring to belong. You can pause, you can be still, you can even gather dust, and still be loved, especially here. In this shop, in this story, in this sleep, where dust remembers what we forget, that we are always worthy of being held, even when we do nothing at all. And so you drifted further, deeper into the place beneath your name, beneath the ticking, beneath the day and the clocks did not interrupt, they simply watched over you. As you finally let go. Part 19. The thread beneath the floorboard shop was softer than ever. The ticking had grown quiet, not because it had stopped, but because it had sunk so deeply into the walls, the shelves, the very air, that it no longer sounded like time at all. A T sounded like peace, the kind that only arrives once everything else has gone quiet, the kind you don't find but fall into. Eldrick sat quietly at the center table. In front of him, the sealed hourglass, the black feathered metronome, the sketch folded gently in a velvet-lined drawer. Around him, the green bell, the unopened drawer labeled "Not Yet," the parcel with no name, and the clocks all still watching, all still waiting. But tonight, something else stirred, not loudly, not urgently, but beneath him, under the floorboards, a thread. He felt it before he saw it, a gentle tug, a whisper in the soles of his feet, a suggestion. Look closer. He stood slowly, walked to the back corner of the room. There, beneath a small stool no one ever sat on, was a single uneven plank, different grain, slightly raised, as if it had not been placed, but grown there. He knelt, pressed his palm against it. The wood felt warm, not heated, alive, and beneath his fingertips, something moved, a thread, thin, soft, strong. He pried the board gently up, and there it was, a single thread, buried in dust, stretched across the hollow beneath the floor. A T shimmered just faintly in the lamplight, not gold, not silver, something in between, a color only dreams remember. Eldrick reached down and touched it. A T vibrated gently at his touch, not like string, but like memory, a vibration like an old voice you'd nearly forgotten. A smile you didn't know was still tucked inside your ribs. He traced it with his finger and whispered, as if reading from something no one else could see, the thread that holds it all, not with knots, but with patience. This wasn't thread from a spool. A T wasn't meant to tie anything together. A T was the reminder that everything was already connected, the clocks to the journals, the pendulums to the hush, the visitors to the bell, the memories to the hours. That had never happened, and you, to this moment, even in your deep sleep, even as your breathing slowed to its gentlest rhythm, even as your body became weightless in stillness, you were still connected, held by something not visible, but present. Eldrick didn't pull the thread, didn't try to follow it. He simply let it run across his palm, and then lowered the board back into place. He stood again, slower this time, not out of age, but out of reverence, because this was not a discovery. It was a recognition that beneath every step he had taken, the thread had always been there. He had simply forgotten to feel it, and now that he had, he didn't need to hold it to remember. It would hold him. He sat once more in his chair and opened the slate blue journal. The page had already begun writing itself in his absence. Tonight, I found the thread. It did not pull. It did not tangle. It did not close a loop. It simply reminded that everything I have ever held is still here, that rest is not the absence of meaning. It is where meaning waits for us, silently, tenderly, Until we return. Aldrich closed the journal, blew out the final candle, and the workshop glowed in the dark, not with flame, not with clocklight, but with a kind of warmth that dust cannot dull and time cannot rush. And you, in the stillness of this long, gentle night, felt the thread beneath you 2.no tighter than it needed to be .no louder. Then the hush, just enough to let you sleep, knowing that you are not alone, not then, not now, not ever. Part 20. The room with no clocks it was near the edge of morning now, not the bright kind, not the one that pushes you to wake, but the kind that lingers, the kind of morning that whispers, stay. Not yet. There's still more peace to be had. The shop hadn't stirred. Not one pendulum had resumed. Not one chime had rung. Even the fire, though long faded, still held the shape of warmth, as if the embers themselves were dreaming. Aldrich sat in quiet reflection, his eyes tracing the familiar lines of the shelves, the soft stacks of journals, the way dust settled like lace in the corners of the room. Then, without a sound, he stood. He walked slowly to a narrow wooden door tucked behind the tall cabinet that held sealed envelopes and half-completed timepieces. This door had no knob, just a small circle carved into its center. Aldrich pressed his palm to it, and it opened in a creak. No resistance. It simply understood the gesture. Beyond the door was a hallway, short, dark, but not unfriendly. Aldrich walked without hesitation, and you followed, in your mind's eye, half asleep, half dreaming, but entirely held at the end of the hall was another door. Wider, plain. He opened it gently and stepped into the room with no clocks. It was quiet in a way that the rest of the shop could never quite achieve, not because the clocks were noisy, but because here there was no measurement at all. No ticking. No counting. In a rhythm to carry or respond to, just stillness, the kind of stillness that felt sacred. The room itself was simple. Wooden walls, a small table, 2 chairs, 1 lamp. On the table sat a glass jar, empty, and beside it, a folded scrap of parchment. Aldrich picked it up, unfolded it carefully, and read the single line aloud. This is the room where time comes to rest when it's tired. He smiled, because he had almost forgotten it. Almost, but not quite. He sat in one of the chairs and leaned back, let his shoulders drop, let the weight fall from his hands. This was the place he came when even holding time felt heavy, not often, but always, when needed. Sometimes he came here after a long night of listening. Sometimes he came after the shop whispered to him with a sadness he couldn't name. Sometimes he came with no reason at all, just to be, and sometimes he didn't come alone. He looked at the empty chair across from him and imagined someone sitting there, a version of himself, maybe, or maybe. You, not the part of you that gets through the day, not the part of you that answers and fixes and remembers things for other people, but the part that just is, soft, tired, present. Aldrich reached into his pocket, pulled out a small folded note, one he had written a long time ago. He read it aloud, so softly you almost didn't hear it. To the one who doesn't know what they need yet, it's okay to rest before you earn it. It's okay to be tired. It's okay to be unfinished. He placed the note in the jar, not to save it, but to let it go, and you felt that too, that quiet kind of letting go, of needing to understand, of needing to move, of needing to prove you are okay, here, in the room with no clocks. You are allowed to be all the things you hide, slow, lost, hopeful, heavy, unsure, and still. Held, Eldrick leaned back, closed his eyes. He didn't need to stay long, just long enough to remind himself that even the keeper of time needs a place where time does not follow, and you now had that two-dot in your breath, in the dark behind your eyes, in the space beneath your ribs where the world quiets down. You didn't need to return to the ticking yet. There was no bell dot and no alarm dot and no summons, only this, a room, a chair, a jar, a memory, a warmth, and the soft permission to let it all be, unfixed, unspoken, unhurried. And as Aldrich stood again, took one last breath in the clockless room, and gently closed the door behind him, you remained, your body heavy now with sleep, your mind softer than it's been in weeks, and somewhere beneath everything, that room, that quiet room, will wait for you always. Part 21, the end that waits in the middle back in the main room. The clocks had not noticed Aldrich's absence, nor had they needed to, because in this shop, time was not held like a schedule dot. It was held like a breath, long and slow, with space between every motion. The pendulums still hung suspended. The hourglass remained still. The rain watch rested in its velvet cradle. Soft as sleep, Aldrich stood quietly at the edge of the room, looking over it all. Nothing had changed, and yet everything felt different. That's what happens when you step into a place that asks nothing of you. You return to the world not with answers, but with space, and space changes things. He walked slowly back toward the center of the room, past the sealed hourglass, past the bell that might never ring again, past the journals stacked like soft promises on the windowsill. He paused beside the parcel with no name, still wrapped, still waiting, then to the drawer marked not yet, still closed, still full of things that were exactly where they needed to be, and then, to you, though your eyes were closed, your breath slow, your body heavy in that familiar warmth, Eldrick saw you, not with his eyes, but with the part of him that had always seen people not for what they showed, but for what they carried, the quiet weight behind their voices, the words they didn't know how to say yet, the moments that still echoed in the corners of their hearts. He did not speak. He simply stood for a while, the way a lamp might stand near a child sleeping on a sofa, or the way sunlight rests across a book someone has fallen asleep reading. Then he turned. He reached for the final journal, the thinnest one, only a few pages left. He opened it to the middle and began to write. This is not the beginning, but it is not the end either. This is the middle, the part of the story where everything has softened, where what we thought we were building becomes something else, something quieter, something truer. The middle is where the noise fades, where the questions lose their sharp edges, where the heart doesn't need answers, only breath, only sleep, only stillness, only being. He paused, tore the page gently from the journal, folded it, walked to the back corner of the shop, and slid. The page beneath the same loose floorboard where the thread had rested the night before, not to hide it, but to let it join the other things. The shop held for safekeeping, moments that weren't ready to be forgotten, but no longer needed to be remembered aloud and still. The pendulums did not move, because the night was not yet over, not in the sense of time, but in the sense of meaning. Some nights don't end when the sun rises. They end when you are ready, and some middles are not the turning point, but the resting point, where the story exhales and waits and holds you. So tonight, this middle is your ending, if only for now, and the clocks agree. They do not press forward. They simply stay here with you, ticking gently into your dreams. And Aldrich. He returns to his chair, worn leather, soft edges, the kind of seat that forgives your shape every time you return to it. He closes his eyes. The shop closes its eyes. Even the light outside, just barely brightening into dawn, chooses to pause. And so do you? Here. Now. In this middle, you are not moving forward. You are not going back. You are not finished. You are not waiting. You are simply. Allow.to be.to breathe.to sleep, and that is more than enough. Part 22. The unfinished clock on the highest shelved air in the shop was still, but not from sleep. It was the kind of stillness that happens when everything, every person, every object, every hour has found its proper place, a kind of stillness that doesn't ask what's next. Because there is no next, only this. Only now. Aldrich remained in his chair, eyes closed, hands resting softly together, and the room, as always, followed his lead. No ticking demanded attention. No wind crept under the doors. No voice whispered across the floorboards, but somewhere up high, near the very top of the shelves that lined the north wall, something stirred. Not a sound, not a movement, just a feeling, a kind of noticing. Aldrich opened his eyes slowly, as if responding to something spoken only in thought. He stood, stretched gently, and walked to the far corner. He pulled the small wooden ladder from beside the bookcase and leaned it against the shelving. Then, one step at a time, without rush, without noise, he climbed. The very top was a single box, unmarked, dusty. He lifted the lid. Inside was a clock, but it was unfinished, not broken, not abandoned, just incomplete. It had no hands. Its face was only half-painted swirls of deep blue, like a sky at dusk, fading into the raw wood and carved on its back, almost invisibly. When you're ready to leave something undone, Aldrich smiled. The unfinished clock. He had built it years ago, in the early days of the shop, when he still thought every story needed a proper ending. Every piece a purpose, every tick a point. But as the years passed, and the nights grew slower, and the clocks grew quieter, he had come to understand some things are most beautiful when left unresolved, not because they were forgotten, but because they didn't need to become anything more than what they already were. He carried the unfinished clock down the ladder, placed it gently on the center table, beside the parcel with no name, Beside the silent pendulums and the sealed hourglass and the old drawer labeled not yet .it fit perfectly, Aldrich didn't reach for a paintbrush. He didn't measure for clock hands. He didn't try to fill in the blank spaces. He just sat beside it and let it be, because sometimes we carry the pressure to complete every moment, to make sense of every thought, to label every feeling, to turn every silence into a sentence. But in this room, that pressure has no home. This room allows for the unfinished, the feelings that haven't formed into words, the grief that isn't sharp anymore, but not quite gone, the dream that never became a plan, the rest you never gave yourself permission to take until now, and you, in your sleep, felt it too, that soft permission.to. Leave something unfinished.to sleep, even if you hadn't earned it.to rest, even if the page wasn't turned yet.to exhale. And not follow it with action. Aldrich opened a small notebook, this one bound in worn gray linen, on the front. A barely visible inscription. For what is enough, even if incomplete, he wrote, "Tonight, I brought down the clock that never asked to be finished. It did not tick. It did not glow. It did not remind me of anything, and yet it belonged. Some things are whole, even when they are not complete. Some endings do not need to arrive. Some stories rest better in silence." He closed the notebook gently, and as he did, you still resting, still weightless, still held in the warmth of the room, felt something inside you relax even further, a part of you that had been waiting for resolution. Let go and found peace in not knowing, not finishing, not understanding, just being. The unfinished clock would stay there now, not as a mystery, but as a message that your rest is sacred, even if the story is still unfolding, that your sleep is enough, even if the day was not, and the pendulums remained still, and the clocks whispered, "Sleep. You are not late. You are not behind. You are not unfinished. You are simply here." Part 23, where time goes when it's done counting. The room had grown brighter, but only slightly, the kind of light that doesn't ask you to wait. It just waits near the edges of the windows, like a friend sitting quietly on the porch, not knocking, just letting you know they're there when you're ready. The clock still ticked, but it wasn't about the seconds anymore. It hadn't been for some time. Now they ticked out of affection, not obligation, like an old friend humming to themselves while folding laundry, or a cat purring in a room that's already asleep. And Aldrich, he stood once more. His movements now were slow, but not tired. They were complete. He walked to the cabinet marked held, opened the small drawer with no label, and took out a piece of folded paper. He had written it a long time ago, before the shop, before the clocks, before even the memory of who he thought he had to be. He unfolded it and read it silently. You couldn't hear the words, but somehow you felt them. You didn't need to know what was written, only that it was the last thing he had been waiting to say, and now he didn't need to say it. He folded the paper again, walked to the sealed hourglass, placed the paper beside it, and whispered, "Thank you for waiting." Then, for the first time all night, he walked to the pendulum of the grandfather clock and reached out, not to restart it, but to rest his hand on it, like placing a hand on the shoulder of someone who has kept watch for a very long time. The pendulum swayed once, then again, then resumed its rhythm and across the room. One by one, the other pendulums began to swing, not abruptly, not urgently, but gently, lovingly, like a choir returning to a song after sitting in silence. The clocks did not rush, they did not race, they resumed as if to say, "We'll keep time for you." Now, Aldrich didn't write in his journal again. He didn't need to. He had written enough. He had listened enough. He had held enough. Now, he simply walked back to his chair, sat down, closed his eyes, and let the clocks do what they were made to do, but not for measurement, not for management, for meaning, for music, for memory, and you. Still wrapped in the warmth of the story, still deep in the rhythm of sleep. We're ready, not to wake, not yet, but to be held. Just a little longer, because stories don't end when the clocks start again. They end when the listener feels full, when the body finally loosens all the way, when the breath forgets to rush, when the mind lets go of the thread and knows. It will still be there when you return, and in the quiet, swinging rhythm of the workshop. You let yourself go completely, knowing there would be one more part, one final note, one last page, still waiting to be turned. Part 24, when the door stays open, the clocks had resumed their rhythm. The pendulums moved now, not as rulers of the room, but as companions to the air.no clock ticked to remind .no chime rang to call you back. Time had returned. But it had. Done so gently, Aldrich remained in his chair. The leather creaked faintly as he adjusted, but otherwise he was still watching the room, still present, not as a keeper of it, not even as its storyteller, but as someone who had remembered something vital, that even time needs a quiet place to rest. He looked around one last time, the rain watch, tucked back into its box, still slightly damp from memory, the memory clock. Its face now dark, but not dim like a lantern that knows the path, even when it isn't lit. The green bell had never rung, but it didn't need to. Its presence had done the work. The unfinished clock sat on the workbench. No hands. No urgency. And yet, it had become the center of the room, and then the sealed hourglass not glowing, not humming, simply resting beneath its soft cloth. Time itself had gone quiet, not silent, just satisfied. And that's when Aldrich did the last thing he would do before standing up. He walked to the front of the shop and unlocked the door. He opened it wide, not because someone was coming, not because something had ended, but because this was not the kind of story that closes behind you. This was a room that would remain open, a clock shop that might appear again on a different night, in a different dream, on the edge of a forgotten thought. He stood in the doorway for a moment, letting the soft, silver morning air drift in. There was no wind, no rain now, only invitation. You remained still, not awake, but not entirely asleep. Your breath was slow, your body warm and weightless, and somewhere, within the soft spaces behind your thoughts, you saw the door open, waiting, not asking you to go, not asking you to stay, just here, because the clockmaker's workshop at midnight was never a story about endings. It was a place, a moment, a breath, And now that you've been here, you'll always be able to return any time you close your eyes, any night your mind grows heavy, any hour when the world asks too much. You can come back to the ticking.to, the hush.to, the chair near the fire.to Aldrich, who may not speak next time, who may not even be there, but who left the door open for you anyway, because some stories don't end. They just grow quieter until they become part of your sleep, and you, soft now in breath and thought and feeling, are ready not to rise, but to rest completely, freely, and when morning does come, you won't remember every word. You won't need to, because the clock's remembered for you, and they always will. End of story. The Clockmaker's workshop at midnight. Thank you for resting here.